So, we're going to talk about hope in a time of eco-crisis and how can we live? How can we live with hope? Well, 100 years ago, the writer Leo and philosopher Leo Tolstoy said, "The only question important for us is, what shall we do and how shall we live?" And as we all know, this question is getting ever more urgent. I suggest tonight that it's going to have a lot to do with breathing in and breathing out, and not just in the literal sense that that's how we keep living, but in some larger senses. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs from Kissed by a Fox, and as I read, I invite you to pay attention to your breathing. So, it's a dependable, steady rhythm. We breathe in, we breathe out. It happens over and over again without our even thinking about it. This is a picture of giant sequoias in California, and I invite you to keep paying attention to this underlying rhythm of your life while I read a few paragraphs. This page comes from a chapter, the chapter called Peralta Creek. I was involved in urban creek work in the Bay Area, and I learned a whole lot about creeks, a lot of which I didn't expect to learn. For most of the year, the speaker was saying, "Stream flows are highest at midnight and lowest at midday." The speaker was James Kirchner, then teaching earth sciences at UC Berkeley. Most of the year, he said, creeks keep up a predictable daily rhythm, surging in the middle of the night and subsiding at noon. They ebb and flow because trees and plants transpire or breathe water out of their leaves and needles. When water evaporates from a tree's leaves, the lowered water pressure in the canopy causes the tree to siphon water upward from its roots. A large, mature tree may breathe 100 gallons of water a day out of its leaves, which means it is drinking that much from the soil into its roots. Multiply those gallons by the thousands of trees and plants lining a creek, and the amount of water being sucked out of the ground approaches a staggering sum. Most of the drinking in takes place during daylight hours because moisture evaporates more rapidly from leaves when the air is warm. As the plants and trees suck water from the ground, less is available for the creek, and its flow subsides. At night, when transpiration slows, more water in the ground flows into and down the creek. Kirchner said, following this stream flow gives us a way of watching the whole watershed, breathing in and breathing out. I blinked, astonished, not expecting to hear about breathing from an earth scientist. Breathing in, breathing out. The most fundamental act of life, taking in energy, expelling waste. Breathing in, breathing out. The rhythm upon which all living rides. In English, the words respire and transpire both come from the Latin respirare, to breathe, also the root for spirit. Respirare itself is derived from the more ancient Indo-European spice, to blow, a syllable that, like the word hiss, enacts a breathing out. Breathing in, breathing out. Respiring, transpiring, perspiring. Air and water circling, moving in and out, a flow, a rhythm, an endless undulation as long as breathing lasts. We step toward greater life in aspiring. We share breath when conspiring. And at the end of life, when the breath flows away one final time, we expire. Breath is life. Inspiring. To breathe is to create. So you are probably all people still breathing, You're probably all people who pay attention to the news, and if you do, you know that March was a very big month for a lot of very bad news. We're not going to go into detail about it all, but I just want to mention 3 news reports that came out in March. On March 14, this is a screenshot from the Guardian's webpage, and it announced a paper being delivered to the journal Ecological Economics about comparing our present circumstances, today's way of life, to the way of life of certain other previous cultures, and they came to the conclusion, 2 conclusions. One is that in situations like ours, collapse is difficult to avoid. And the other conclusion is that there is much we can do. By the way, this study was partly funded by NASA. This is not fly-by-night material. On March 18, then, the American Association for the Advancement of Science put out a 3-point website called What We Know. The 3 points are: 1, that climate change is real, it's caused by us, and 97% of scientists agree. 2, we may be changing nature irreversibly. And 3, there is much we can do. Finally, on March 30th, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published its 2014 report on the consequences of climate change, which are already being felt around the world. The report says there are already threats to food sources, to security, to water, and that these threats will get worse. And there is much we can do. Is everyone still breathing? Yeah. It's a lot to take in. We are in this, our way of life, our contemporary way of life, is in serious trouble. I happen to think that's a good thing, and that good things can come of that. But it is probably not going to be an easy road ahead, and it's definitely not going to be an easy road for the many people who are being affected very seriously already by climate change. So it's looking kind of bleak. But that wasn't all those reports said. They said it looks bleak and there is much we can do. So this is Joanna Macy, the great eco-Buddhist teacher, philosopher. She was interviewed a few months ago, and you can find her interview on this website. This is a screenshot from that interview. In that interview, Joanna Macy said, "It looks bleak, big deal, it looks bleak." These were her words. Yes, it looks bleak, but you are still alive now. You are alive with all the others in this present moment. And because the truth is speaking in the work, it unlocks the heart. And there's such a feeling of adventure. It's like a trumpet call to a great adventure. In all great adventures, there comes a time when the little band of heroes feels totally outnumbered and bleak, like Frodo in Lord of the Rings, or Pilgrim in Pilgrim's Progress. You learn to say, "It looks bleak, big deal, it looks bleak." I find those very hopeful words, and so the rest of tonight we're going to focus our attention on how much there is that we can do. Going back to those 3 reports for a moment, all 3 of them came to 2 major conclusions. They said them very simply. The first conclusion they came to is that what we need to do is to use fewer resources, and that includes stop burning fossil fuels. And the second conclusion they came to was that we need to work toward equality among one another. So basically, they said we're out of balance in 2 areas. One is in relation to the rest of nature. We're using too much of it. The other is in relation to one another. 2 enormous goals, but they're pretty straightforward. Enormous, complicated, possibly, yes, but straightforward. Use fewer resources, stop burning fossil fuels, and work toward equality. So how in the world do we do that? I want to suggest it has a lot to do with, guess what? Breathing in and breathing out. So how does this work? Well, suppose we picture breathing in like this, a straight arrow going upward. Our society loves the breathing in. We love to take in, we love the getting, the buying, the collecting, the growing, the increasing, and we would like it to go on forever. We love breathing in so much that we have a distinct fear of breathing out. We as a society do not value giving much of anything away. Think, for instance, of the laws governing our corporations, especially investor-owned corporations, which by law are mandated to try to make a profit continually, forever. To the system of capitalism, the notion of giving back or giving out in equal measure is unthinkable. Or take the way we measure progress in our society, or the health, the basic welfare of our society, by economic growth, increase. The GDP, the gross domestic product, must go up forever. And it's very bad news when it does sometimes go down. As if we wanted to breathe in and in and in and never stop. Is this like nature? Well, no. In nature, what goes up has to come down. And it has to be balanced by the other moment. The breathing in is always balanced by a breathing out. And as we saw, even an earth scientist will talk about a watershed doing this. This doesn't just belong to biological creatures. It belongs to biological systems. It's the cycle of life that governs all living on this earth. Every taking in is balanced by a giving out. Every growing is balanced by a dying. Ebb and flow, wax and wane, breathing in and breathing out. And in this breathing in and breathing out, there's room for every facet of experience. In this picture, in the upward arrow, there is no room for dying. So because our society values the continual growth, we have a long history of looking at dying as a tragedy. This arrow is a picture of unending growth, and I'm told it's also a good picture of a cancer cell. A cancer cell is always increasing, always growing, because it lacks the mechanism to turn off growth. It's unable to die. I sometimes think if there's any bright spot in the epidemic of cancers in our world, it is that cancer cells are showing us the value of dying, how important it is to be able to die. There's also no room for loving in this picture, because loving requires a give and take. Loving always implies a giving back. I remember a few years back, Daniel Wildcat, who is a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma, he visited town. He's a well-known teacher and philosopher, has written quite a number of books. And he spoke on the CU campus, and he said, "You've heard about the ATM model of family, right?" He says, "You know the relatives who only show up when they need to withdraw funds? Well, that's the kind of relationship we've been practicing with the earth. We've been making a lot of withdrawals in the last 200 years and haven't put much back. Loving relationships are made of something different. They're made of reciprocity. They're made of equality, balance, respect. We've also been told that this increasing arrow is instinctive, that this is the normal state of affairs, that natural systems, if left to themselves, will just try to increase and increase and increase. I think in particular of Thomas Hobbes back from the 1600s, who said that when creatures, whether humans or animals, are left to their own devices, life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, because every creature is in a war of all against all. By that theory, which became the theory of our current economic system, continual taking in is instinctive. I don't think he was watching very closely, because biological systems increase and decrease. Left to themselves, they will balance themselves out continually with increase and decrease. One can think of predator-prey relationships. So for instance, you have, if rabbits proliferate, suddenly more foxes will be born. More foxes will eat more rabbits, the rabbits will decrease, and then the foxes will decrease. Ebbing and flowing. I recall how astonished I was a couple of years ago when NCAR scientists announced that these graphs, which describe predator-prey relationships among animals, can also be applied to the weather. The same graphs that apply to foxes and rabbits apply to clouds and rain. They said the relationship between rain and clouds is like predator and prey. More clouds brings more rain eats the clouds, and then the clouds decrease and the rain decreases also. So this cycle, this rhythm of increase and decrease, breathing in, breathing out, applies in all places on our earth. So let's get back to how much there is that we can do and where we can find hope in a time of crisis, in a time of eco-crisis. If the breathing in and breathing out defines life on earth, and if our society is a whole lot happier with the breathing in and knows how to practice the breathing in a lot better than the breathing out, I want to suggest that the things we can do that will help the most, a lot of them have to do with closing the circle. The breathing out, half of the cycle. And we're going to spend the rest of our time going through a bunch of pretty pictures, mostly pretty pictures, of a lot of wonderful things happening that help to close this circle of life. So there's the collective breathing out, which of course we need to pay more attention to. This is as you probably all recognize, a poster from election last fall about municipalization. When it comes to stopping fossil fuels, I'm preaching to the choir here in Boulder, with so many of you working on municipalization. Obviously, we need to control our carbon emissions, and this is one way to do it. But we might not have time to wait for municipalization. I happen to think that getting solar PV systems on roofs is urgent, and that every roof makes a difference, and that the sooner we start covering a lot of roofs, the better off we're going to be, because every roof wins us a few minutes or hours. I don't know the numbers. I don't know if it even can be calculated. Every roof helps. This is a picture of my friend Rosanna Francescato. She lives in San Francisco. I knew her, met her in the Bay Area. She started out as a copy editor like me, and at a certain point she became filled with urgency about spreading solar power. So she started volunteering for this nonprofit in the Bay Area called Grid Alternatives, and I hear they're going to open an office in Colorado shortly. She started volunteering for them, and what they do is they install PV systems on rooftops of low-income families. So they've been in operation for 10 years, and in those 10 years, they've installed 400 systems for 400 families. And those 400 families, in addition to contributing to the slowing of our increase in climate change, are also saving electricity. Over their lifetimes, it is estimated these 400 families will save in electricity costs $10 million. Rooftop solar, I think, is urgent. If you have a choice about what to do with your rooftop, put some solar panels on it. We've got plenty of sun here in Colorado. Another whole area of giving back, closing the circle, is the area of restoration. And I want to go over a few areas of restoration, a few components of restoration. And keep in mind, this all falls under the category of what we can do right here, right now. So there's restoring with native seeds. These are a couple of photos I took last fall in October on a hillside in Longmont, where we were collecting the seeds of the plant called winter fat. That's the plant on the right. It's very fuzzy, and the seeds feel like cotton, and we were all carrying big bags, big pouches, and we would stuff these seeds. And it doesn't take long for that many seeds on one plant to fill a bag. So after 2 hours of work or so, most of us had bags that were bulging, enormous. This was a program run by Wildland Restoration volunteers. They run all kinds of seed collecting programs. They have seed banks that they take the seeds to, and these seeds become available for other restoration projects. But what I want to say about this day was how fun it was. There were maybe 50 of us there, and we spread out over the hillside, and we crouched over these plants, and boy, did the tongue start wagging. We, in the group that I was with, so we were in small groups of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people. In the group I was with, we started telling racy jokes and reciting limericks. And pretty soon, other people heard us guffawing, and they kind of worked their way over to our group. So we had a marvelous time. You talk about saving the earth and having fun doing it. This is one way to do it, and it's going on right here, right now. Restoring urban creeks, another aspect of restoration, giving back in a big way. So the best practices for urban creeks a number of decades ago was that you put them underground, get them out of the way, put them in culverts, channelize them, control them in every way possible so that you don't have flooding problems. And this happens to be, it's very clear now that best practices have changed. This is a screenshot from the website of the EPA, giving some best practices these days in the area of restoring urban creeks. And it has to do with taking care of them, restoring their banks, all other sorts of good stuff. And you can look all that up if you want to. Here's a picture of why these new best practices could be a lot more helpful. This is a picture I took on the morning of September 12. This is standing on Linden Drive, at the edge of Linden Drive, where it intersects with Wonderland Hill. That is 2 Mile Canyon Creek, which comes down Linden Drive, or in that case that morning it was actually coming down Linden Drive, filling the road. There were 2 major problems at that intersection. One of them is that the creek is culverted right there. You can imagine what happened in conditions of a flood. It proceeded to go southeast toward Iris and flooded a lot of houses in the way, because the second major problem at that is not just the culvert trying to take the creek out of its historic creek bed in a different direction, but also because most of its historic creek bed has been filled in with housing. And I imagine those houses really got a washing, and not with clean water either, with a lot of silt. We have tended to think in Boulder that we kind of have the creeks thing covered because we did such a good job with Boulder Creek. But in fact, every so often along the hills, along the ridge, there is a watercourse coming down. And all of those watercourses need a similar kind of attention that has been given to Boulder Creek. There is much caring for creeks remaining to be done here in Boulder. And it can be done by people in neighborhoods and by people at the level of the city. This is a brochure put out by the city of Seattle on how to care for natural drainages, which amounts to creeks or natural waterways. It's available on the web, and it's written in very plain English about how to landscape, how to clean up, how to care for watercourses that go through neighborhoods in cities. The advice is going to be different for a place like Colorado than a place like Seattle. But it's an example of something that cities can do at the city level to take care of their urban watersheds. This is a screenshot from a website that I just discovered while I was preparing this talk. The website is ecosystemgardening.com. And it's all about planting natives, and it's I think it's authored by a woman in the Northeast. So she lists information from each of the 50 states on where to find information about native plants in your state. It's very comprehensive. I was very impressed. And of course, you all know the theory of why it's needed, because suburbia is a mishmash of exotic plants collected from many different parts of the world, which may look pretty but may not be as useful as they could be to the insects and critters who feed on the insects, the birds, the butterflies of a particular local area. So we may plant a lot of pretty-looking flowers, but maybe the insects and the birds who come here and evolve to live right here don't quite know how to use them or don't like them as well as the stuff that they evolved with. Planting natives in your yard is a way of giving back to the local area. It's a way of restoring the personality of this particular place. A lot of cities around the country have incentive programs for citizens to get rid of turf and plant natives or other xeriscaping in their yards. Boulder doesn't have that kind of program, and it could use it because there's a whole lot of Kentucky blue in Boulder. And Kentucky blue has roots that are about 2 to 3 inches long, and that's not a good way to take care of soil in a windswept and an area like the Front Range. Dry in some seasons, eroding in other seasons, a lot of wind. Kentucky blue is not equipped to stand up to that. The native plants, the native prairie plants of this area typically have roots that begin at about 15 inches and might go to 36 inches or more. They're built for keeping the soil in. They're built for feeding the critters who live in this area. So there's a lot that can be done to restore the personality of a place. You know, we go out in nature, which typically means going away from town, going outside of town, partly for the noise, to get away from industrial noise. But I think we're also looking for something else. We're looking to get in touch with how an ecosystem works that is less disturbed than in town. And I think of that as getting in touch with the personality of a place. We have kind of a mishmash in town. We don't have a Front Range personality in our yards in town the way we do in the mountains. planting natives in yards is a way of restoring the personality of a particular place. I like this quote from the website. Do you ever feel like the environment is being destroyed and there's nothing you can do? This is one thing you can do, the property where you live, to give back to your place. And here is a program, if you would prefer doing it with other people. There is a program at Chautauqua run by Open Space and Mountain Parks, and I'm an alumna of that program, and there's at least one other person here in the room who is an alumna of that program. But it's another opportunity where we sit and weed, and we get our hands in dirt, and again, the tongues begin to wag, and the stories happen, and the conversations happen. I've had some of the most profound conversations of my life with other people sitting in the dirt in that particular garden, and I've made some lifelong friends, giving back to the local ecosystem. Then there's, if you're inclined to work on policy, there's the matter of changing laws. There's a group in Boulder called the Boulder Rights of Nature that is working to change the laws, to bring balance, so you can think of our system of law as upside down, because it puts humans at the top as if we had control and could say how things go. Rights of Nature recognizes that that is all wrong, that in fact nature is at the top, and we all owe everything, including our very lives, to the health of the ecosystem that surrounds us. The Rights of Nature movement is active. It's a worldwide movement. Countries like Bolivia and Ecuador have enacted it at the national level. There are 36 communities in the United States that have passed Rights of Nature ordinances, and many places also around the world. So it's happening. Another way to get involved. So then we come to a few of the quieter ways of giving back. I think of just going out and enjoying nature. I think of the theologian Karl Barth, who said, "Joy is the simplest form of gratitude." Just enjoying is a way of giving back to the local area, to wherever you are. Going out, enjoying, appreciating. That previous photo was from the woods along the Oregon coast, where there are enormous trees. Here is our own woods, Goshawk Ridge, a photo I took of the penstemon blooming in early June a few years back. Appreciating and enjoying are closely linked, and they're both powerful forms of giving back. And remember that anything we give back, any giving back activity that we engage in, is going to help right the balance between ourselves and the rest of nature. These are a couple of the quieter forms of giving back, but no less powerful for being quiet. I hear that these flowers, the pasque flowers, are blooming already. I haven't gotten out to see them. They're one of my favorite flowers. We're so unused to seeing appreciation as serious business. We think of it as taking time off or time out. But appreciating is the foundation of a two-way relationship. Think of your relationship with your family members, your spouse or your partner or your children or your siblings. They don't go very well if you don't take time to appreciate one another. And appreciation is a foundation of relationship with the other parts of nature as well. Then there's teaching others to appreciate. On the bottom right, there is a nature education class, and in the upper left, there is a hike led by Dave Sutherland of OSMP, and that was at Goshawk Ridge a couple of years back. Teaching others just to appreciate nature, if you're so inclined, is a wonderful way of giving back, closing the circle. And there is a new movement springing up around the country called the Master Naturalist movement. You've probably heard of Master Gardener movement, that there are classes in each state for becoming a master gardener. Well, now there are classes in each state also for becoming a master naturalist. And on that same website that we saw a few minutes ago, ecosystemgardening.com, there are links for the classes in each state that will lead you to become a master naturalist. I just found out about this movement just last week, as a matter of fact. So it's a wonderful new way. They teach you about your local ecosystem, and then you can pass that appreciation and knowledge along to others. We've been talking so far about connecting with other parts of nature. There's connecting one to another. Human-to-human connection. Because the more of this kind of attention people get at whatever age, the less stuff we need to satisfy ourselves and the fewer resources we will use. This means that any work people are doing to increase connections between people is contributing to the work of addressing the ecological crisis. We might rethink how we reconceptualize how we think about the work, the activities we're already doing as ways of giving back. Any kind of solidarity, building solidarity, helps to close the circle. Then there's art. How do we open the heart? One of the ways I've practiced for many years is through art projects. Making art tends to engage the heart. Creativity is a powerful process that engages the whole person. You can't just stay in your head and make a good work of art, a pleasing or challenging or inspiring work of art. It requires the whole person. The word heart includes the word art. In a time of eco-crisis, we need all kinds of creativity. We need artistic creativity. This is a picture I took of a yellow jacket nest. The nest is so it's lying on its side, but when it was hanging in the tree, it was probably about this tall. And it fell out of the tree one December at my feet. And I picked it up, and it was the softest, most beautiful paper I had ever handled. It's just astonishing. I wish I could show you the whole thing, and you could turn it over and see the inside, the layers and the cells and more layers. It's just astonishing, and it's soft, and it's pliable, and it's beautiful, beautiful colors of grays and yellows, and just gorgeous. Yellow jackets are not really considered welcome neighbors in a lot of places, including in Boulder. Yellow jacket nests are the kinds of things people tend to run to run for pesticides to get rid of. But yellow jackets are pollinators, and we need pollinators, especially in a time of eco-crisis, in a time when we're losing other kinds of pollinators. And so pesticides, finding friendlier ways of coexisting as neighbors with all kinds of creatures is an incredibly important way of giving back. And then there's the end of life, the obvious giving back, the giving back of our breath. I take a lot of inspiration from the hospice movement, which is refocusing and revaluing the process of dying. And I also think of the dying well movement. We talk about dying well. It's often talked about as an adverb, how you actually negotiate the process of at the end of life. But the dying well movement, which I just learned about from an interview, a Krista Tippett interview on being, and you can find that interview also. The dying well movement is not about how you die, an adverb, but about how you are when you die. An adjective. You are well when you die. Somebody who is healed in yourself, healed in your relationships, dying as a well person. The work of reacquainting ourselves with the ebbing of life, especially of human life, is a terribly important work in the time of eco-crisis. And then, of course, there's the dying of other creatures as well. I'm not going to talk about extinction here, but I am remembering a moment last fall. It happened to take place at Naropa. There were about 200 environmentalists gathered in one room, and someone led a moment of silence for the bears who had died. So there had been a series of bears coming to town, and they had been coming to town repeatedly, and by that date, 4 bears had been killed by the state. And in that room of 200 people, a minute of silence was held in honor of the bears who had died. And it was something that probably not very many of us had ever experienced. This was something we do for other human beings. It isn't something we normally do for other animals. It was a respectful minute, and it was quiet, but you could just about hear the wheels turning in every head. Wow, I've never done this for a bear before. We might do it for pets, we might do it, but we did it for bears, and it was a marvelous sign of respect. This kind of giving back, too, is needed. Finally, I want to close with just a couple of very concrete examples of closing the waste circle, the waste cycle. Attention to our human waste is an incredibly important part of closing the circle of the biological circle of life. I love the organization EcoCycle because they're doing so much to keep stuff out of landfills and reuse stuff. I think that just the fact that we could consider we as a society could okay the manufacture of something like plastics, which cannot be absorbed by the soil and which feed no one. It shows just the extent of our vehemence against the ending of life, the ebbing of life, the giving back part of life. But here's another example of a different kind of closing the waste circle, and it's going the other way, a way that we might close the circle with a forest. The upper right is a picture of a forest in Colorado that is in the process of being beetle killed. We tend to think of that as a tragedy. But let's keep our minds open for a minute. On the left is a picture of the pine pitch that a tree puts out in its effort to expel bark beetles. And if it doesn't succeed, the bark beetle gets in, and it calls other bark beetles, and they all come over, and the tree dies. But in that whole process, each tree is releasing a great deal of sap. Now, I just found out in the past couple of weeks what good medicine pine sap is. Maybe you all remember the product called Pine Sol. There's a reason pine was used in that product. Pine sap has antibacterial properties, and it draws bacteria out, so it's especially good for use on things like puncture wounds. Spread a poultice of pine sap on a puncture wound, and it will draw the bacteria out, and you may not need a tetanus shot. It could take care of the tetanus infection. It's also good for insect bites. I got a bunch of insect bites last week, and the same day that somebody gave me a patch of pinyon pine sap, the sticky kind. It's not fully dry yet. So I spread it on my insect bites, but actually, since I like to learn about the world, I spread it on half my bites to see what would happen. So the half that I spread the half of the bites that I spread the pine pitch on, the bumpiness went down, the itchiness went down instantly, and they didn't itch again at all. And the half that I did not spread it on, the next day they were still very bumpy and very itchy. So it might be good medicine for insect bites. I am also told that in World War II it was made into a soap as a mosquito repellent, and soldiers who washed with that soap in the morning would be mosquito-free during the day. A beetle-killed forest might be a forest of medicine just waiting. So it looks bleak. We are in a serious situation, but big deal, it looks bleak. There is a whole lot we can do. It falls in the two categories of restoring balance with the rest of the earth and restoring balance with one another. Use fewer resources, work toward equality. And it has a lot to do with the breathing in and breathing out cycle of nature, especially the breathing out half. So if you're helping to connect people with other people, or practicing appreciation for nature, or planting natives in your yard, or working to change laws, they all add up to loving. How shall we live in a time of eco-crisis? We'll live by loving, because the loving and the giving back are worthwhile, even in a crisis, and especially in a crisis, because these things change the basic ground rules of our society. Doing each of these things may not change the whole picture, but believe me, if you do even one of these things, it's going to change the part of the picture that you're involved in. And it's going to help set the foundations for a better kind of society down the road. So I would like to read a story about receiving a gift of love from a critter. This is a story about Rudy. And Rudy lived in a wildlife rehab center where I volunteered during a very difficult time in my life. And most of the time I was feeding baby birds, but sometimes it was my job to feed the resident coyotes and fox. And feeding them involved not just giving them their food bowl, but bringing them inside from their daytime enclosures, bringing them in for the night. And especially if they didn't know you very well, the process could get tricky. This is from the chapter called Red Foxes. I squatted on the floor, waiting for Rudy to finish pacing. At last he had slipped inside the safety of his night pen, and I had dropped the gate to lock him in. Now his food bowl awaited. But would he approach it with me crouching only 2 feet away? The red fox and I had performed our usual evening dance. Me, stand just inside his night pen with my hand on the long rope leading to the gate. Rudy, race around the outside enclosure, dart into, then out of the night pen. Me, stand stock still. Rudy, creep up to the doorway, peer in. Me, don't breathe. Rudy, take 2 steps in and dart out again. Once he knew the staff person bringing him in, Rudy slipped into his night pen readily. But until you had passed his friend test, he tried to keep his options open. I was safe with Rudy, or thought I was. Hand-raised by humans, Rudy was the darling of every staff person at the center and had never shown a hostile whisker to anyone. He was wary, like a good fox, but not unfriendly. Because Rudy seemed safe, I wanted to get closer. We were making good progress. Last week, as I squatted on the floor, he had padded softly toward me, sniffing. I stayed motionless, afraid I would spook him if I so much as breathed, while his pointed black nose probed the air just inches from my body. Tonight I squatted again, this time closer to his bowl. Soon Rudy was padding toward me again and sniffing. He made a slow circle around me, one moment almost touching, the next retreating. My knee on the ground was beginning to ache. How long could I stay propped in this position? Suddenly, he stepped directly in front of me. Then, without warning, he lifted one paw, put it on my lower knee, and, raising himself vertically, stared directly into my face. I gasped. I couldn't help it. I'd never been that close to the needle-sharp teeth of a fox. Captivity, I knew, makes people, and especially wild animals, crazy. Was Rudy planning to attack? After studying my face up close for a moment, Rudy opened his mouth, stretched out his tongue, and with it reached between my parted lips. Startled, I made an effort to keep still. After licking the inside of my mouth for a few seconds, he withdrew his tongue, let himself down to the floor, and began gobbling his food. I'd just been French kissed by a fox. I was elated. I wanted to spit fast and hard, all in the same moment. A little dazed, grinning, and working grit out with my tongue, I slipped out the door, leaving Rudy to his dinner. After that night, Rudy's kisses became regular. I never did get used to that gritty tongue. He'd been rooting around in the earth and in who knows what. And neither did I get used to being French kissed by a creature who smelled more than a little of skunk. But neither did I catch any dread diseases. Only much later did I find out what Rudy was actually doing. Visiting a friend one day, I pick up a book on wildlife tracking and turn immediately to the chapter on foxes. There I read that newly weaned fox kits remain in their den while the parents go out and hunt. When one adult returns with food, the kits eagerly crowd around, trying to lick the parent's mouth, probing inside it with their tongues to see what mom or dad has brought for dinner, and stimulating the adult to regurgitate the food. Rudy wasn't kissing me after all. He was checking the menu. He must have wondered why I never coughed up the dog chow, dead mice, boiled eggs, and chopped fruit that appeared in his bowl. He was also greeting me as a fox greets a trusted member of the family. Years later, I still feel honored. Thank you very much for your attention.